Welcome to In the Lab, a podcast from Luminate, the leading provider of data and insights for the entertainment industry. I'm Andrew Wallenstein, Chief Media Analyst with Luminate Intelligence. Our guest today is Natasha Hritzuk, the head of corporate research at Warner Brothers Discovery. Her team recently completed a fascinating study of the U.S. viewing audience through the lens of their political beliefs and what we can learn about how conservative-minded consumers differ from more liberal tastes. There's a lot of interesting findings to get to, so let's get into it. Thanks for joining me, Natasha.
Very happy to be here.
So I want you to explain not just the study first, but how you approached it, because there's some interesting methodological things that you did to take on this very meaty, complex topic.
It was not something that you could just kind of dive into the way you would with a conventional study. And so we actually worked with Megan and used Prism data. So actually at the zip code level. And without getting into the intricate details, we created ideological segments that range from these are actual humans that live in America. So we knew it was based on, not just hypotheticals, but that these were defined first-party data segments or third-party data segments from liberals all the way to more hardline conservatives. So the group that was especially relevant to us were the four more conservative groups. So, we have a group that is much more on the extreme conservative side. You might use a term like MAGA, people who are conservative but not quite falling into that camp, more moderate conservatives, and then conservatives who could tilt a little bit more into the liberal camp. So it was a spectrum. Why did we do this? Because once we could unpack who these guys were, where did they live, were there certain characteristics of, regarding their like demographic characteristics they had in common, it gave us a little bit more clarity on how to find them. Because the second phase was we needed to recruit these guys so we could talk to them. So that prism exercise was super helpful in just giving us a really concrete definition of these segments so that we could find them in the wild and then pull them into the study.
And you spoke to them at length, right? I mean, it wasn't just answering survey questions.
100% no, because certainly we could have taken that approach, but when you're talking about ideology, it's not just a badge that you wear. There's presumably context and values and a whole set of characteristics, perceptions that define and kind of are the building blocks of that ideology. And that's what we wanted to unpick. So we actually did 60 ethnographies, and then those were quite long and lengthy. And then we did 30 additional in-depth interviews with people that were particularly interesting or felt like they were particularly representative of the kind of perspective we wanted to dig into. So 91-hour interviews. So I would actually say that's almost like quali-quant because it was so robust.
So we actually have a taste of what you got to hear from those ethnographies. So we're going to just play here about a minute of video that has a sampling of what you heard. Let's take a listen.
Stories that shows real pain and purpose. Stories about justice or survival.
Is something that's hardworking, like Nani, for example, in Lilo and Stitch. It's all about being tight-knit with your family, grooming your kids to how you want them to act as an adult.
Romance or real true to life, just make you feel warm and fuzzy and good. And I like all the fixer-upper HGTV type shows showing you something real that actually happens, fixing up somebody's home.
More wholesome movies, more patriotic movies, more people are just doing good for each other.
Dramas dive deep into the human nature, into human behavior, personal responsibility, and the consequences of their choices.
More like romantic comedies like Hallmark movies, like Virgin River, that innocent, hopeless romantic kind of like love and seeing family support and families come together.
A lot of like sports movies that have this like comeback story. And I just saw the F1 movie with Brad Pitt and I was like on the edge of my seat.
Straight male beer drinking, Americana, fishing shows, shows that are outdoors, shows that are a glimpse of what I value.
So that was certainly interesting. And so really walk us through, articulate What do conservative viewers want from their content? What did you hear from them in these ethnographies and otherwise that gave you a clear picture?
So as you heard through that video, I think, we all go into it. Of course, we're all going to have biases, even researchers, God bless, even we have biases. And I think I was expecting something a little more binary, a little more black and white. And the truth is, there was so much nuance. And you heard the nuance in the videos. People weren't just talking about like religion and beer and guns. I think the core is that conservatives have been maybe a little bit mischaracterized. And so what we heard was so empathy building and gave us, I think a depth of understanding that we really didn't have going into this. So first of all, as a former political scientist, what I found fascinating is that conservatives really are small c conservatives. They're people who revere tradition, the past, the American dream. You work hard and, you're going to get your just rewards in the end. They value community. They value family. They look to the past as kind of a beacon of what when America was great. They're patriots. They believe in the good in America. And they are not necessarily religious in the conventional sense. I mean, there were definitely religious pockets, but these are people who really believe in decency, morality, being kind to people, not terribly into violence, community is important. And so the reason why I kind of dwell on all of these values is because these values inform the sort of content that conservatives want to watch. So at a high level, I would say that content that contravenes these values or is in conflict with these values is just naturally going to be less attractive to conservatives.
So give us some examples of some no-nos here that are going to set off conservative viewers.
So there is definitely an aversion for content that's become politicized. I mean, we'll just cut to the chase. I think there's a broad view, and this was expressed pretty much across the board, that kind of in the early 2000s, Hollywood was kind of hijacked by progressives. And they feel that there's been this politicization of content. Conservatives, like all of us to some extent, when we turn on a television set or go to the movies, we want to be flat out entertained, and conservatives particularly feel this way. They're not looking for cognitive challenge necessarily. They're not looking for, something that kind of leaves them thinking and kind of conflicts with their worldview because they've just opened their mind to this whole new kind of mind-blowing concept. They want to relax. They want to be comforted. They want to be soothed. They want, the entertainment to be pure entertainment. And so when content conflicts with their values, it's not going to be any of those things. You're not going to feel relaxed. You're not going to feel entertained. You're going to feel aggravated. You're going to feel this kind of sense of the way a lot of the consumers framed it was that, we're the underdogs. We don't count. Our perspective isn't being reflected anymore. And when we are represented, we're made fun of. We're being treated as these kind of single dimensional characters. And like, we're people too. We're nuanced. We're not just these kind of, hyperbolic, like gun-toting, horse riding people. We in many ways, I think, reflect that kind of view of Americans in the mid-century of the previous century, the white picket fence America. And I think, so anything that conflicts with that value system, so is going to just rub them the wrong way. So the woke agenda, bringing up abortion, bringing up, movements like BLM, immigration, gun control. Now, let me just back up. They are okay with these issues being brought up, but not when the full view is being reflected. So if only one political perspective is being reflected, like it's pro-life, but they don't bring up the fact that maybe the girl struggled with getting an abortion and was conflicted. That's the problem that they have, is that when only one view is represented, it kind of neglects the perspectives that are important to them. So at a high level, I would say keeping politics out of content that you want to scale is kind of lesson number one.
Now, is lesson number two that, I'm just making a blanket assumption here, does that mean liberals love highly politicized content that doesn't soothe them? And or I guess I'm asking, are they the polar opposite of conservatives per your study?
Well, here's the fascinating thing about liberals. So I'll back up a little bit just to kind of illustrate this point. For liberals, content is like their hobby. You know, the way that, venophiles love wine, that's the way liberals feel about content. They are omnivorous content consumers. They'll pretty much watch anything if it's good. And so, yes, liberals love to be challenged. They love to have kind of darker, more dystopian content. They want to be sort of, they don't even mind ambiguity and complexity and seeing the dark side of things. So they do have more of an appetite for that. But by the same token, they actually watch a lot of content that's very conservative leaning, the procedurals, even shows like House of David that are overtly biblical. So that's what's fascinating about liberals. They are omnivorous. They'll consume anything. Um,
As
with
as a liberal who has enjoyed House of David on Amazon Prime, I could certainly attest to that. But do you get the feeling then, if I'm hearing you right, it's not just that they have different views or
Yeah,
tastes, it's content or entertainment in general is more central to the very identity of a
yes.
liberal as opposed to a conservative who maybe compartmentalizes it.
Exactly right. I think for liberals, like we talk about when we go, I say we, I mean, I guess, the cat's out of the bag, but, you're at a dinner party and everyone's talking about the last show they watched. And, content is just kind of woven through our lives in a much more intricate way. Whereas for conservatives, it's just a thing they like to do amongst many things they like to do. So they might say, like, I like fishing or I like antiquing or I like gardening. And, in the evenings, I like to wind down with a TV show. If you ask them about the role of content in their life, it's much more passive and it's more peripheral. Not to say they don't watch a lot of TV and they don't go to movies, but it's not as central to their identity. They talk about, as you heard in the video, community, family, all these other, I guess I would say, more sort of traditional values.
So, how do these preferences translate to actual viewing choices? Because you've actually looked at some of the Nielsen data separating out what is most popular among conservative viewers versus
Mhm.
liberals.
So, that there's more in they have more in common, liberals and conservatives, with viewing than you would think, and it's largely due to liberals being more omnivorous. Um, I guess I could start with shows that conservatives don't want to watch. Shows like Euphoria. I mean, need I say more? Even even shows like Succession. Succession was people who are more fiscally conservative could kind of appreciate the story of wealth, but it's a little dark and dystopian, and it just felt kind of they were looking for that kind of moral redemption. That's another big thing, that kind of moral redemption. Okay with seeing dark stuff, but it's got to be wrapped up in the end. There has to be some lesson, some sort of journey where people kind of realize, oh my God, I was that way, but now I'm this way, and I've kind of learned the lesson. So shows that don't have that resolution are not appealing. But so shows that are predictable. So procedurals are very big with conservatives for a number of reasons. One, it's relaxing. You kind of know how it's going to play out. There's going to be a crime committed, or there's going to be a fire, or there's going to be a body found. And then it all kind of wraps up in the end and there's justice served. Another big conservative need with content, that there's some sort of justice served. There's, again, this resolution. So procedurals are huge. Um,
Is there
and
anything that
there's,
would surprise us? Anything where it's like you would
oh
think
my gosh.
conservatives? Yeah, tell us.
Yes, yes. Because procedurals are kind of obvious, right? Like you think, there's certain networks that really double down on procedurals, and you're like, yep, that fits. Um, we kind of, I guess, just assumed that conservatives would be more sort of narrow in their tolerances than they were. A show that came up time and again as beloved. Was Modern Family. And in fact, the conservatives that we spoke to, so again, this massive group of 90 people kept saying time and again, you know what we feel sad about? The last great family sitcom was Modern Family.
I'm
And
surprised they would like Modern Family in the first place, given, and
exactly,
again, we're talking about stereotypes here sometimes,
yes,
but there's a presumption that, a conservative viewer might be put off by its portrayal of a modern gay couple.
100%. That was the first place my brain went. I kind of wanted to say, wait, but there's a gay couple who are married with a child. And we had these brilliant British moderators who kind of gave a sense of sort of impartiality so they could ask those questions. And the interesting thing that pretty much everybody said was, yeah, but that's okay because it was within the context of this big family and they were a component of the family and they loved their kids, they were committed to each other. So we were okay with that. And that's the fascinating thing, because even though you'd think that LGBTQ portrayal would be a flashpoint, not if it's within a broader context of, or within even like a thematic context that is appealing to conservatives, which is the family dynamics, the community, parents dealing with teenagers, the grumpy grandfather irritating the grandkids. Like these are all kind of universal human truths that we can all relate to. Do you want to hear the second one?
Sure.
Schitt's Creek.
Okay.
Again, you're like, but there's a flamboyant gay character. How does this gel? Well, here's the fascinating thing. Why this worked with conservative audience is that it was about a family who was callow and money driven, and they get a comeuppance. Everything falls apart. They move to this terrible motel in rural Ontario, and they learn the true meaning of family. Their characters evolve. They become better people. So there's that moral arc. You can have diverse casts, that's not an issue. You can have gay characters, that's not an issue, but it has to be baked within this broader context that's appealing to conservatives.
Now, it's funny when I looked at the some of the Nielsen data that you put together, I guess I wasn't surprised to learn that some shows like White Lotus,
Yeah.
With Love, Megan, and Temptation Island were most popular among liberal audiences. I mean, I could certainly see why conservatives would abandon these, shall we say, very progressive shows in
Yeah.
droves.
Yeah. Yeah. No, okay. Well, do you know the funny thing about White Lotus? It did come up a little bit in the research, but it wasn't a scalable show that attracted conservatives. But the one part of that show that did appeal to conservatives who watched it was that, again, there was that comeuppance theme. The father slipped off the path, had done some shady stuff, and then kind of learned some key lessons in the end. So there was weirdly that moral arc with the family component. But yeah, those shows are definitely going to be more liberal leaning. And look, if we can pick up some conservatives along the way, that's awesome. But what's interesting is as you start to move towards shows that are overtly I guess by our definition, more conservative, the audiences grow exponentially. So you get pretty, slightly smaller audiences with shows that are really explicably for, or I should say explicitly for a liberal audience. When you start to move towards shows like Grand Ole Opry's 100th year celebration or NCIS or like any of the Chicago's, the audiences are huge because guess who's on the journey? Conservatives love these shows, but so do liberals. So that was really fascinating for us to learn that, because if you're in the business of building shows that scale, you have a better shot of baking in or sort of building a bigger audience if the shows tap into conservative themes, because liberals will likely be on that journey if it's a quality show and a good show. You don't necessarily see the opposite thing happening. You build a brilliant show for liberals, conservatives will not hop on that bandwagon.
But as you alluded to earlier, tastes overlap more than you might expect.
Yeah.
And there were certain genres where you saw that.
Yeah, comedy. It's so funny because I feel like comedy has kind of had a bad rap recently, and there's this view that like comedy's not bringing in the numbers, and maybe this is context driven. I mean, the world is, it's kind of a tough world these days. Like there's always some troubling thing going on. But, what's interesting is that liberals and conservatives alike are all troubled by what's going on. It's not that, conservatives are celebrating a war and liberals are celebrating, something. I mean, I think everybody's feeling the pain on multiple levels. And, I think this is classic human nature. You're looking for a counterbalance. And comedy is the one genre that is one of multiple genres, I should say, that are broadly appealing and ideologically agnostic. What conservatives said is that there is more permission to make fun of everyone in a comedy because it's all with the broader aim of getting a laugh. So we were so surprised to see SNL, which I just assumed would not be something that conservatives would like. Now, not all conservatives, but SNL did actually have a conservative audience. When we went into the Nielsen data, we saw that SNL was one of the top-rated comedies, even with conservatives. But when we dug in, it's not because they're making fun of Trump. It's because they make fun of everyone. They make fun of housewives. They make fun of dads. They make fun of movie stars. They make fun, like it's equal opportunity kind of poking at people. And I think that is kind of the joy of comedy. It's not meant to be mean-spirited. Procedurals were another big one that captures both. So we talked a lot about procedurals, the fires, the cops, the bodies, etc. But the third one was unscripted. And that's kind of fascinating to us. I mean, obviously, we've got a fair amount of unscripted, but the reason why unscripted was bridge content is because I guess there's this broad view that, like, look, there's no Hollywood agenda here. These are just people who were pulled in off the street, so to speak. There's no script. They haven't been told what to say. So even if they're diverse, even if they say things that maybe seem offensive or they move into kind of political waters, it's just the way the conversation evolved. So for some fascinating reason, even though is unscripted really completely unscripted, but they get a pass. They get a pass. And so those are the three big kind of consensus categories: comedies, procedurals, and unscripted.
Well, I hear that and I say, well, that's great news for the studios because that tells you that there must be strategies to employ here about bringing both audiences together. What are those strategies?
Okay, so I would say, just going back to that initial point that I made, I think earlier on in our discussion, I don't want to remotely imply that there isn't a role for politics in content, and there should be. I mean, look, content influences culture. You think about, there are hundreds of TV shows that have had an impact on, the zeitgeist on a more profound level. So there's still room for those shows. But if you're trying to bring in conservatives and liberals, you don't want to have an overt political agenda overlaying the show or movie. Or if you are going to introduce politics, bring both sides to the table. That's really important for conservatives. And liberals won't object because they're more open to having multiple perspectives reflected. I think the second thing is it's really important to tap into the shared values, and those shared values that are ideologically agnostic are family, integrity, freedom. Family sitcoms. People want, like, what's more relatable than a family? And you think back to the 90s and there were a lot of family sitcoms. And why are family sitcoms so wonderful? Because they tap into stuff we all experience. Dad being silly, mom, helicoptering in, sorry, stereotypes, teenagers being irritating or like veering off the path and doing something naughty, aging parents. Families are fascinating, and that's something we can all relate to. I think there's a lot of ground that can be mined there. I would say, thirdly, like, human beings are more alike than we're different. We all go through very similar things. And I think these universal human truths are also a really rich territory. We all deal with aging. We all deal with loneliness. We all deal with financial insecurity. Well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people do, and so all of these things that human beings just generally go through that represent struggles or triumphs, unemployed but found a job, or kind of hard scrabble and made my way to the top. I think these are just like enduring American tales that will always be broadly appealing. And maybe we're not telling enough of those stories. I also think that this gets a little bit more into the alchemy. So I think about a show like Task, which is broadly appealing. And you would say, okay, well, it's on HBO Max, and doesn't that tilt a bit more liberal? Potentially. But what's interesting about a show like Task is it balances out kind of the edgier, darker themes that are appealing to liberals, which is, two guys basically robbing drug dealers. But what's interesting about these two guys is they're working class guys, they're garbage collectors, sanitation engineers living in a downtrodden part of Pennsylvania. And why are they doing this? Because they're trying to build a better life for their kids. which is the part that's appealing to conservatives. Breaking Bad's another great example. The number one, every conservative male we talked to loved Breaking Bad. I'm like, but drugs. But what's happening there again? Sure, there's the dark, edgy stuff, but he's just trying to provide for his family. Again, appealing to conservatives.
Yeah, well, there is so much here. I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but the good news is you and I are going to have a whole second conversation over on the Variety Strictly Business podcast, where we'll unpack some of the themes that we're just getting into here. But thanks, Natasha, for walking us through this fascinating piece of research.
Thanks for giving it airtime. We've absolutely loved doing this study. It's been fascinating for us. Thanks, Andy.